I told my mom's boyfriend he had 30 days to leave. When I was around 17, my mother's financial situation changed significantly and quickly. She didn't make a big announcement about it, but the evidence was hard to miss. Old debts cleared, a house purchased, my sister's education fully funded, money set aside for mine. She had come into a substantial amount, and she was methodical about where it went. Around that time, she had been seeing a man named Derek, who had a young son from a previous relationship. They moved in with us not long after, and life settled into a new normal. Derek worked and kept his own money. He didn't contribute to the household financially, but at the time, I was a teenager, and it wasn't my house to have opinions about. Then my mother got sick, the kind of sick that reframes everything immediately. She sat my sister and me down one evening and went through everything with the kind of calm clarity that I think only comes when someone has accepted what's coming and decided to use the time they have left well. The house would be mine. Both of us were being taken care of financially. She had set up a separate fund specifically for Derek's son, locked until he turned 18, untouchable by anyone else. Then she asked me directly whether Derek and his son could stay on in the house after she was gone while he got himself sorted. I said yes. Before she died, she also sat Derek and me down together in the same room and made two things explicit. He needed to start looking for his own place, and she was not leaving him anything. She said it clearly, in front of both of us, with no room for misinterpretation. That was years ago. Derek was still in the house. I had been paying every bill the entire time. Mortgage, utilities, taxes, insurance, everything. He bought food for himself and his son on the weeks he had custody. That was the full extent of his contribution. We coexisted without much friction, and I didn't push the issue. He had been with my mother for years, and she had asked me to give him time. I told myself I was honoring that. His girlfriend started appearing recently. The first couple of visits, I kept my distance and said nothing. The third time she came over, I was in the kitchen making food when she walked in, picked up a plate, and reached directly into the pan I was cooking in to help herself. When I asked what she was doing, she looked at me without any particular embarrassment and told me I should think about finding somewhere else to live, and that staying in a house connected to my dead mother's old relationship was pathetic. I called Derek downstairs. I told him I wasn't going to be spoken to like that in my own home, and I needed to understand what exactly his girlfriend thought the situation here was. He wouldn't make eye contact. Then he said something that I had to ask him to repeat because I couldn't quite believe I'd heard it correctly. He said my mother had promised him the house, that he was being generous by letting me stay. My mother made her intentions clear to his face with me sitting right there. There was no ambiguity, no private conversation that could be reinterpreted later. She had been precise about it specifically to prevent this kind of revisionism. I told him he had 30 days. He didn't take 30 days. He packed that same night and left with his son. 2 days later, his ex-wife called me in a fury, telling me I had taken a home away from a child. I understood why she was upset. I also understood that Derek had lived in that house for the better part of 8 years without contributing to a single bill, had been told clearly by my mother that it wasn't his, and had just stood in my kitchen while his girlfriend told me I didn't belong there. My mother was precise about her wishes for a reason. I was just finally acting on them. The silence that followed the slamming of the front door was heavier than the noise that preceded it. For 8 years, that door had opened and closed to the rhythm of a family that wasn't quite a family, but felt enough like one to keep me quiet. Now, it was just me. The house felt cavernous, and the air still smelling faintly of the expensive perfume Derek's girlfriend Sarah had been wearing. I walked back into the kitchen. The pan was still on the stove, the burner off, but the iron still radiating a low, dull heat. The plate she had reached for was sitting on the counter, a smear of sauce across the porcelain. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just about the food or the rude comment. It was the casual entitlement, the way she moved through the space as if she were already picking out curtains for a house she didn't own. Derek hadn't even looked at me when he left. He had just gone upstairs, grabbed 2 duffel bags he clearly kept semi-packed, and ushered his son Leo out the door. Leo looked confused, his eyes darting between his father and me, clutching a handheld gaming console like a lifeline. I felt a pang of guilt seeing the kid's face, but then I remembered Derek's words. Your mother promised me this place. She wanted me to have a legacy for Leo. The lie was so bold, it was almost impressive. My mother, a woman who had spent her final months with a spreadsheet and a legal pad, meticulously partitioning her life so that no one could fight over the scraps, would never have promised a house verbally. She trusted ink, she trusted signatures. The next morning, the phone calls started. The first was from my sister, Elena. She lives 3 states away and has always been the one to tell me I'm too soft. When I told her what happened, she didn't sound surprised. Finally, she said, the crackle of the long-distance line sharp in my ear. I've been waiting for you to grow a backbone about that house for 3 years, Mark. And he was a squatter with a nice haircut. He was with Mom for 5 years, Elena. He was there for the chemo, the hospital stay. I felt like I owed him something. He was there because he had a free ride, she countered. Mom paid for everything while she was alive, and you've been paying for everything since. You didn't owe him a decade of free rent, especially not after he let that woman insult you in your own kitchen. I hung up feeling more unsettled than validated. I spent the afternoon moving through the rooms Derek and Leo had occupied. They hadn't taken everything, just the essentials. A stack of Leo's comic books sat on the coffee table. A half-empty bottle of Derek's cologne was still in the bathroom cabinet. I gathered it all up and put it in a box by the door. That evening, Derek's ex-wife Qley called. I expected the anger, but I wasn't prepared for the level of vitriol. How could you do this? She hissed. Leo is distraught. He thinks he's done something wrong. You threw a child onto the street over a kitchen argument? I didn't throw anyone on the street, Qley, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I gave him 30 days. He chose to leave in 3 hours, and he lied to my face about my mother's will. He told his girlfriend this was his house. He's been a father figure to you. He's been a roommate who doesn't pay rent, I snapped. And if you're so worried about Leo's stability, maybe ask Derek why he hasn't saved a single dime of his salary in 8 years while I paid his property taxes. I ended the call before she could respond. My hands were shaking. Then I sat down at the heavy oak dining table, the one my mother had bought with the first chunk of her inheritance. I remembered her sitting there, her hair gone, a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her head, looking at the deed to the house. house. This is your anchor, Mark, she had told me. The world is going to try to pull you in 1,000 directions, but you keep this. Don't let anyone talk you out of what I worked for, she knew. Even then, she knew Derek's nature. She had seen the way he leaned on her, the way he drifted through life waiting for the next person to provide the floor beneath his feet. She had been kind enough to give him a head start, but she had been smart enough to give me the keys. Over the next week, the neighborhood grapevine did its work. I saw Mrs. and Gable from across the street looking at me differently when I took the trash out. Derek had played the victim well. To the outside world, he was the grieving widower, though they were never married, who had been heartlessly evicted by a cold-blooded stepson. Then, the legal threat arrived. I received an email from a local firm representing Derek. It was a formal request for equitable distribution of the property. The claim was that through his years of domestic labor and emotional support, Derek had established a common law interest in the home. I almost laughed. I pulled out the file my mother had left me. In it was a document Derek had signed 2 months before she died. A clear, notarized acknowledgement that he had no legal claim to the property and was staying as a guest at the discretion of the heir. But my mother hadn't just been precise, she had been surgical. I scanned the document and sent it back to his lawyer within 20 minutes. I didn't hear from them again. A month later, I was finally clearing out the garage when I found a small box tucked behind some old paint cans. It was filled with Leo's old toys, the stuff he'd outgrown years ago. At the bottom was a framed photo of my mother, Derek, and Leo at the beach. They looked happy. My mother was laughing, the wind catching her scarf. For a moment, I felt the weight of the family we could have been if Derek hadn't tried to rewrite the ending. If he had just been honest, if he had just respected the boundaries my mother set, he could have stayed another year. He could have left with my friendship. Instead, he tried to steal the anchor my mother left for me. I put the photo in the box with the rest of the things and taped it shut. I didn't send it to him. I put it in the attic. Maybe one day Leo would want it, but for now, the house was finally quiet. The ghosts were gone, and for the first time in years, the air in the kitchen felt clean. I sat out on the porch that night, watching the sun dip below the tree line. The mortgage was paid, the taxes were current, and the locks were changed. I was 25 years old, and I was finally living in my own home. My mother had been methodic about where the money went, but she'd been even more careful about who it protected. I finally understood that her last gift wasn't the house itself. It was the permission to defend it. The silence of the house was no longer heavy. It was yours. For the first time in nearly a decade, but you weren't a guest in your own life. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator belonged to you, paid for by your mother's foresight and your own endurance. But silence has a way of forcing you to look at things you've ignored. A few months after Derek left, the first property tax bill arrived in the mail. It was addressed to me, as always, but seeing it sit on the counter without Derek's presence hovering nearby felt different. It was a reminder that the safety net my mother built was finite. She had cleared the debts, but the world keeps charging you for the space you occupy. I spent that Saturday in the garden. It had been my mother's pride. Roses, hydrangeas, and a small patch of herbs that Derek had let go to seed because he didn't have the thumb for it. As I pulled the waist-high weeds, I found a small plastic dinosaur buried in the dirt, one of Leo's. I sat back on my heels, the cold mud soaking into my jeans. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "He's struggling, Mark. He can't afford the deposit on a decent place. We're in a motel. Please, for the sake of the years we spent as a family." It was Derek. He didn't even have the courage to call. He was using the family card again, the same one he'd played while his girlfriend was trying to evict me from my own kitchen. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. The emotional labor his lawyers had mentioned was a phantom. Real labor is pulling weeds until your fingernails bleed. Real labor is working 2 jobs to make sure the mortgage on a dead woman's dream doesn't default. And Derek had confused being present with contributing, and he had taught his son that the world owed them a root just for existing. That evening, I finally went into the separate fund documents my mother had left for Leo. I hadn't looked at them since the funeral. She had been incredibly generous, enough for a full university education and a head start on a home of his own. But there was a clause I had forgotten. The funds shall remain in trust until the beneficiary reaches the age of 18. In the event of the beneficiary's father attempting to borrow against or legalizing access to these funds prior to that date, the trust shall be frozen and managed solely by the executor. The executor was me. She had known. She had seen the motel rooms and the unpaid deposits in his future long before I did. And she wasn't just protecting me from Derek, she was protecting Leo from Derek. I realized then that my mother's precision wasn't coldness. It was the highest form of love. She knew that the people we love are often the ones most capable of dismantling our lives if we don't set the columns straight. I went back inside and started a pot of coffee. The kitchen was clean. The pan Sarah had reached into was scrubbed and hung on the rack. I looked at the empty chair where Derek used to sit, scrolling through his phone while I cooked and cleaned around him. The guilt I had carried for months, the feeling that I had broken a family, finally evaporated. You can't break something that was held together by a lie. I picked up the plastic dinosaur from the counter and placed it in the box in the attic. One day, when Leo was 18 and free of his father's entitlement, I would give him the box and the keys to the trust. Until then, I would be the gatekeeper, just like Mom. I turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs. The house was quiet, but for the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt ready. The first night of absolute silence was different than I expected. It wasn't a sudden burst of triumph, but a slow, heavy wave of relief that settled into my bones as I lay in the dark. I stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows of the old oak tree dance across the plaster. For years, this house had been a place of quiet negotiations. Every footstep in the hallway had been a calculation. Was I being too loud? Would I wake Derek? Would I run into him in the kitchen and be forced into a conversation about his plans that never seemed to materialize? Now, even the floorboards belonged to me. The next morning, I woke up without that familiar tightness in my chest. The smell of Derek's stale, burnt coffee was gone. There were no crumbs on the counter that weren't mine. I brewed a fresh pot, leaned against the marble island, and just looked at the room. It seemed larger, brighter, but reality doesn't stay quiet for long. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but the area code told me it was Qley, Derek's ex-wife. I took a breath and answered. "Mark, we need to talk," she began. Her voice wasn't as as shrill as it had been a few days ago. She sounded exhausted. Derek is staying with his sister, but it's not working out. He has no savings, and he's telling everyone you cheated him out of his inheritance. Qley, we both know there was no inheritance, I said, my voice steady. I felt my fingers tighten around my mug. My mother was more than clear. She gave him years of rent-free living. What he did with his salary during that time isn't my burden to carry. It's about Leo, she said softly. He doesn't understand. He misses his room. He misses the stability. That was the moment I felt the anger I'd been suppressing for years. Not the loud, explosive kind, but the cold, clinical variety. If it's about Leo, Qley, then ask Derek why he spent his money on new electronics and expensive dinners for his girlfriend instead of a security deposit. Ask him why he stood by while that woman insulted me in my own home. Leo is in this position because his father treated his life like a long vacation. The silence on the other end was telling. She knew. She had known Derek longer than I had. She knew he was a drifter who specialized in leaning on the strength of others until they snapped. I'm not abandoning Leo, I continued. There's a trust fund for him. My mother set it up. It's safe, and it's for him alone. But Derek doesn't get a cent of it, and he's never living here again. That is final. After I hung up, I walked into the room Leo had occupied. It was jarringly empty. A few scraps of poster tape still clung to the walls, little white squares marking where his world used to be. I sat on the edge of the mattress. I remembered the day my mother signed the final papers for the house. She was so weak by then, and her hands shaking as she gripped a pen. She looked at me and said, Mark, people will try to make you feel guilty for having what they want. Let them talk. Pity is not a currency you can use to pay a mortgage. At the time, I thought the illness had made her cynical. Now I realized she was arming me. She knew Derek wouldn't leave as long as things were comfortable. She knew I was the one who would eventually have to draw the line in the sand. Over the next few weeks, I started the renovations. I ripped up the old carpets that had trapped years of dust and bad memories. I painted the walls in colors I actually liked, moving away from the neutral tones Derek had insisted on to avoid making a fuss. With every gallon of paint, the house felt more like mine and less like a museum of my mother's final illness. One afternoon, while clearing out the back of a closet, I found a small, leather-bound notebook of my mother's. It was a ledger of sorts, but not for money. It was a list of dates and observations. October 14th, Derek bought a new watch today. He didn't offer to help with the grocery bill again. Mark looks tired. November 3rd, I told Derek again today that the house goes to Mark. He cried. I don't think he believes me. Reading her words, I realized she had been documenting his entitlement for a long time. She hadn't been blind to it. She had been gathering the evidence I would need to finally find my resolve. A courier rang the bell later that day. Registered mail for Derek Miller, the man said. He doesn't live here, I replied. It felt better every time I said it. I don't have a forwarding address. This is the 4th attempt, the courier grumbled, marking his clipboard. Collections notice. I closed the door and leaned my back against the wood. Collections, of course. He had tried to maintain the lifestyle my mother provided on a budget that couldn't support it. He had bet on my weakness, and he had lost. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the spot where I had finally stood my ground. The house was quiet. The rain was starting to tap against the glass, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like the master of my own fate. I wasn't the boy standing on the sidelines anymore. I was the heir, the owner, and finally, I was home. The weeks grew into months, and the seasons began to shift the color of the garden from the deep greens of summer to the brittle golds of autumn. Although I had stopped jumping every time the floorboards creaked, I had stopped expecting to find a stranger in my kitchen. The house was finally mine, but the weight of the past didn't just vanish. It transformed into something I could manage, like an old piece of furniture I'd finally decided to refinish. One Saturday morning, while I was clearing out the garage, a space Derek had used as a graveyard for broken electronics and half-finished projects he never intended to complete, I found a small, locked metal box tucked behind a stack of winter tires. There was no key. I took it to the workbench, feeling a strange thrum of anxiety in my chest. I used a flathead screwdriver to pry the latch open. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was a collection of letters, all addressed to my mother, postmarked from years ago. They were from Derek. I didn't want to read them, but I couldn't stop myself. They were filled with the same grand promises he had tried to sell me. I'm going to make enough to buy us a place of our own, one said. I'm looking into investments so you never have to worry again, said another. He had been selling her a fantasy for years, even while she was the one paying for his son's school clothes and the very roof over his head. It was a paper trail of a man who lived in the future because he couldn't handle the responsibilities of the present. I realized then that my mother hadn't just been generous by letting him stay. She had been paying for the silence. She had bought herself a version of a family, knowing full well it was built on sand, just so she could have some peace before the end. I gathered the letters, walked out to the fire pit in the backyard, and watched them turn to ash. I didn't feel like I was destroying memories. I felt like I was finishing a job my mother started. As the smoke drifted up into the gray sky, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Qley. Leo is starting his junior year. He's been asking about you. He found an old photo of you two at the lake. He's struggling, Mark. Not for money, just he feels like he lost a brother. I stared at the screen for a long time. The easy thing would be to delete it, to keep my peace intact, to keep the walls of my fortress high. But I looked at the house that was supposed to be an anchor, and I thought about my mother's precision. She had been precise about the money, but she had also been precise about the people. She had set up that trust for Leo for a reason. If she saw something in him that was worth saving from his father's shadow. I typed back, tell him he can come over next Saturday to help me paint the garage, but tell him he comes alone. No Derek, no Sarah, just him. The reply came back almost instantly. He'll be there. The following Saturday, a beat-up car dropped Leo off at the end of the driveway. He walked up the path, looking older, more tired, but his eyes lit up when he saw me standing there with a pair of rollers and a bucket of slate gray paint. We didn't talk about Derek. We didn't talk about the motel or the apartment or the legal threats. We just worked. We spent 4 hours covering the grease stains and the scuffs of the past with a fresh, clean coat of gray. There was a rhythm to it. The sound of the rollers, the smell of the paint, and the quiet coordination of two people moving in the same space without getting in each other's way. When we finished, we sat on the driveway with 2 cold sodas. It looks better, Leo said, wiping a smudge of paint off his forehead. forehead. Cleaner. It is, I said. It's a fresh start, Leo, for both of us. He looked at the house, then back at me. I'm sorry he tried to take it, Mark. I really am. He couldn't take it, I said firmly, because it was never his to take. And one day, when you're older, you're going to have your own place and you're going to understand why I had to do what I did. You have to protect what you build. He nodded, and for the first time, he didn't look like a victim of his father's mess. He looked like someone who was starting to understand the value of boundaries. When the car came to pick him up, I watched him walk away. I went back inside, washed the brushes in the sink, and looked at my reflection in the window. The house was quiet. The garage was gray. The letters were ash. I sat down at the table and opened my laptop to check my own savings. I had a mortgage to manage, taxes to pay, and a future to plan. I was 26 now, and the world was still pulling me in 1,000 directions, just like my mother said it would. But I had my anchor. I had my teeth, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was protecting. 2 years passed, and the peace I had cultivated within those 4 walls finally felt permanent. The renovation was long finished. The floral wallpaper and the scent of Derek's cheap tobacco were nothing more than a fading memory, replaced by the smell of fresh cedar and the quiet hum of a house that was finally at rest. But then came the day I had marked on my calendar years ago, Leo's 18th birthday. I was sitting in the living room when the doorbell rang. It wasn't the tentative knock of a teenager anymore. It was heavy, insistent. When I opened the door, I didn't see Leo. I saw Derek. He looked older, haggard, with deep lines etched into a face that had spent too much time squinting at life's disappointments. He wasn't wearing a suit this time, just a frayed jacket and a look of desperate entitlement that I recognized instantly. He's 18, Mark, Derek said, skipping any pretense of a greeting. The trust. It's time. I didn't invite him in. I stood in the doorway, my frame blocking the entrance to the home he still thought he had a claim to. Leo is 18, yes, and I've already spoken to him. Why are you here, Derek? He doesn't know what to do with that kind of money, Derek hissed, stepping closer. He's a kid. He'll blow it on games and junk. I found a property, a real investment. We could get a place together, a home for the family. You have to authorize the release to me so I can manage it for him. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel an ounce of the old guilt. I didn't see the man who had comforted my mother. I saw the man who had tried to steal from his own son before the boy even had a chance to start his life. No, I said. The word was short, sharp, and final. You can't do that. It's his money. Exactly, I countered, leaning forward slightly. It's his money, not yours. My mother wrote the trust specifically to keep you away from it. She knew you'd come knocking the second the clock struck midnight. I spent years of my life in this house, he shouted, his voice cracking. I gave her everything. You gave her nothing but a bill I had to pay. I snapped back. You lived here for free while she was dying, and you didn't contribute a single cent to her care or this roof. You want a home, Derek? Go earn one, but you are not touching Leo's future. I saw his fist clench, a flash of the old temper he used to hide behind passive aggressiveness. But before he could speak, a car pulled up behind his. Leo stepped out. He wasn't the scrawny kid in the thin hoodie anymore. He was a young man, steady and observant. He walked up the driveway, ignoring his father entirely, and looked at me. Is he bothering you? Mark, Derek spun around. Leo, son, listen. I'm trying to look out for us. This guy is hoarding your inheritance. We could get out of that apartment. We could have a yard again. Leo looked at the house I had kept clean, the garage we had painted together, the garden that was now blooming with the roses my mother loved. Then he looked at his father. I'm moving into the dorms next week, Dad, Leo said quietly. Mark already helped me set up the direct pay for my tuition. The rest of the money stays in the bank. I'm not buying a house with you. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek looked between us, realized the family play was dead, and finally saw the wall of the bridge he had burned years ago. He didn't say another word. He just got into his car and drove away, the tires spitting gravel against the pavement. Leo stayed for dinner. We sat at the oak table, the one my mother had bought. We talked about his classes, his roommates, and his plans for the summer. There was no drama, no revisionist history, just the truth. As he was leaving, he stopped at the door and looked back at the living room mantel where the photo of them at the beach still sat. Thanks for keeping it, Mark, he said. The house and the money. I think I would have lost it all if you hadn't been the one holding the keys. I was just following orders, Leo, I said with a small smile. I watched him drive off toward his own life. I went back inside, locked the door, and turned off the lights. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like a job well done. I went upstairs, laid my head on the pillow, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't think about Derek at all. I just thought about the roses and how they would look even better next year.